Good morning, everyone. Everyone joining, just to say a quick hello. It's still a minute to go. So we wait a couple of seconds and we will start on time. All right. So the seconds are gone. I see it's a full house. So a good morning to everyone in the call and a very warm welcome from our side to this webinar 2025 on pay transparency survey, decoding pay, perceptions, practices, priorities. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Michelle Sutter, and I'm an adjunct professor at the University of St. Gallen for Organization Control and Governance, and also a director of the Institute for Law and Economics. And it's also a very pleasure to welcome you to this early morning webinar to present the new edition of the Pay Transparency Survey. This is an initiative of the Network for Innovative Corporate Governance at the University of St. Gallen, together with academia and practice, and in this case, the Institute of Law and Economics of the University of St. Gallen is representing academia. And here we're also having HCM International representing practice. HCM is a partner of our network, and where we team up to explore matters related to corporate governance and compensation. My gratitude here goes to the entire HCM team, foremost Dr. Stefan Hostetler, Dr. Hannah Hummel, who is in the call for their commitment to researching best practices on good corporate governance. Also today in the call, besides Hannah and myself, is Davide Pallegan, is a senior consultant at HCM and a PhD student at our university. Also in the call is Johanna Kafanke, consultant at HCM, and thanks goes also to Emira Trabelisi, consultant and marketing with HCM. Before I will hand over to Hannah to kick off the presentation today, let me please remind you that you can ask questions during the Q&A function throughout the presentation. And please note that the whole webinar is also being recorded. So Hannah, the floor is yours, and I'm very glad that we can have such a nice introduction this morning, sharing new insights on the topic with our audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and a warm welcome also from the HCM side. We're very proud that today we can present to you the results of our second Pay Transparency Survey, which was conducted between June and September this year. As pay transparency is an evolving topic, we're happy that today we're not able to provide you only with this year's insights, but also to show you the development and the progress on pay transparency, which was made in the last 2 years. And this will also then reveal the directions and expectations going forward. So throughout the presentation, we will always provide you as well with the perspective and the comparison with the results of our survey, which we conducted 2 years ago. So let's take a brief look at the sample of participating companies. In total, 70 responses were gathered, which is comparable to the first survey in 2023. As you can see from this page, the participating companies are of different size, ownership type, and industries. On the left, based on the number of employees, we see a focus on larger companies. In total, over 70% of the sample have more than 1,000 employees. In terms of ownership type, you can see this in the middle, we see a 60-40 split between listed and privately owned non-listed firms. This means that about 1/5 of the Swiss Performance Index is represented in our sample. In terms of industries, the sample mirrors a typical distribution across Swiss sectors. Specifically, we see a high representation of financials, industrial companies, and healthcare, while other sectors make up for about 1/4 of the sample and include, for example, energy and IT. On the next page, we come to the topic of gender pay equality. When analyzing pay transparency, of course, the gender distribution is a topic, and therefore it's very natural to account also for differences in the gender distribution of employees. These distributions vary by industry. Concretely, we have a 60-40 split again for male and female of all participating companies. However, as you can see on the left here, there are male-heavy sectors included, for example, industrials with a 70-30 split. And others show a higher female representation, for example, healthcare with 55% female employees. Next to gender, there are also some responses included in the survey which are based on a personal assessment. So therefore, it is important to know who was the respondent to the survey. And as you can see here in the middle, the survey insights predominantly mirror the views of the HR function. So 96% of the responses were provided by either compensation benefits professionals or the CHRO. The HR function has a central role nowadays in steering pay transparency, as you can see on the right. For more than 6 companies out of 10, the HR function is responsible for steering pay transparency. And this represents a 6% increase compared to the results of our survey 2 years ago, as indicated by the green arrow that you can see in the graph here. While the responsibility for steering pay transparency was more dispersed or even unallocated in 2023, we see a clear progress and a more specific functional allocation of that role within HR with our newest results. So let's turn to the detailed results. And Michelle, you mentioned it briefly. Today, we follow a structure that we developed. And the structure is along 3 major layers: perceptions, practices, and priorities. And these 3 lenses also allow us to see not only what companies think about pay transparency, but also what they do today and where they intend to go next. We'll start with perceptions, because pay transparency above all is a mindset shift. Here we explore the importance of the topic, the factors driving pay transparency, and its multidimensional nature. Further, we will understand which opportunities are seen and where concerns remain. Next, we look at practices. Where do companies stand in terms of actions taken, including pay reviews and communication approaches? This is where perceptions meets reality. How transparent are companies sharing pay information, and how far have they moved from intention to implementation over the past 2 years? Finally, we turn to priorities, the roadmap on remuneration. We asked organizations where they currently stand and what changes they expect with regards to different pay elements. Moreover, we get a view on where they plan to invest next in grading systems, in communication, in pay governance, or in leadership training. Taken together, these 3 perspectives, perceptions, practices, and priorities, provide a clear picture of the current state of pay transparency in Switzerland, how it has shifted since 2023, and what is likely to come next. Now we're keen on getting the actual insights, so I hand over to Davide to take you through the detailed results.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And good morning, everybody. So we begin our journey from the most subjective answers, as Hannah said. So those that try to gather the perceptions of the participants and their maturing perspectives as well. Let's start with a look at how pay transparency is gaining traction, because more than 57 of survey participants are now considering pay transparency as important or very important. And that's a notable jump because in 2023, the number was below 50%, was at 48%. And that's not the only change. The second one, the material one, is that the share of respondents saying that the topic is not important at all dropped sharply from 10% down to just 1%. So what's behind those numbers, those high-level numbers? Well, ownership type, whether a company is private or public, doesn't really seem to play a role. What seems to matter is actually the sector and definitely size. So let's look at sector on the right-hand side of the screen. You can see divergences here. So industrials, for instance, nearly 7 out of 10 respondents are saying that this is important or very important, but the same is not true for financials, where the numbers is only 43%. When it comes to size, there's a clear divide at 500 employees. We notice that companies larger than that tend to place much higher importance on the topic. And we are also glad to share that we have a second variable measuring momentum. So we asked survey participants whether momentum is being gathered by within the organization over the past 2 years, and we got a resounding 74% of both moderate and significant increase. So pay transparency is definitely developing. It's not a buzzword anymore. It's becoming a strategic reality for HR functions. Now, let's talk about what's pushing this change. And of course, as you can see, top left, regulation remains the key driver. We have a striking 88% of publicly listed firms identifying regulatory pressure as the key motivator, but also private firms, you see, it's still high, 62%, but still it's not the only factor. So companies are also reacting to internal pressures. So employees are getting more and more demanding, and it's also a matter of perceived employer branding and reputation, as well as being able of attracting top talent. Still, we also notice that there is a moral dimension underneath. So nearly half of the private companies and over a third of the public ones are saying that they address pay transparency simply because it's the right thing to do. So you see this ethical commitment. When we then deep dive into regulation, of course, Swiss companies are exposed to a number of laws. We definitely mentioned the Federal Act on Gender Equality that was reviewed in 2020 in Switzerland, but it doesn't stop there. So in the US, you have some of the US states introducing measures referring to California and New York, for instance, and the UK is the same. Still, one piece of regulation stands out is the 2023 EU Pay Transparency Directive, which EU member countries are now transposing into national regulation. And they're doing that because there's a hard deadline in July 2026. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, 76% of survey organizations are saying, well, this is strongly shaping our activities. And about the 24% that says, well, that doesn't really matter, actually, those are really Swiss firms. So out of those 24%, 65% of those firms are very much based here, 90% or more employees based in Switzerland. So in the end, Swiss firms with a European footprint are feeling the directive impact quite strongly. Next question is, what do we actually mean with pay transparency? It turns out it's definitely not a simple concept, and we would like here to emphasize the multidimensional nature. Think of it as a cube. Here you see 6 different faces of the cube, and for 9 out of 10 participants, you really see a consensus around pay determination. So being clear about how pay is determined and communicating that clearly to employees. This was the 87%. As you can see, material still an increase of 10% compared to 2023. And beyond that, you also see a third of companies that highlight the two dimensions of sharing salary bands as well as disclosing pay gaps. So this is what pay transparency means. What it doesn't mean anymore, it's a full radical internal transparency. So this figure was at 7% back in 2023. It's now 1%. It's only one company mentioning that. And, you know, we see this as a clear evolution and the topic maturing towards a more balanced and structured approach. Who's gonna benefit from the pay transparency initiatives? Well, it's not just some selected groups of employees, it's broader, it's all employees as well as candidates and external stakeholders that are standing to gain from greater clarity and fairness on pay. Of course, with new opportunities, there are also new challenges. So from an HR perspective, the first challenge remains managing employees' reactions, you know, especially if new pay transparency reveals unfairness being ingrained in the pay structures. Second, we see an increase and a potential higher personnel costs hitting the P&L, especially in the short term. And third, we see an increasingly worry around the reduced flexibility in rewarding exceptional performance. What you also see on the right-hand side of the screen is a list of potential challenges, more like from a qualitative perspective. So there's this concern around more and more gossiping, trying to understand how much colleagues are getting, as well as administrative pressure on HR coming from the EU directive, giving more and more rights basically to employees, or that's at least the vision of the directive. Finally, let's look at the human side of the transition, the employees. So continuing on the right-hand side of the screen with the risks at employee level, here we are talking. So again, sensitive emotional responses have to be handled. We know from academic research that envy and frustration among staff are common when you realize someone else is better paid or unfairness in the system. That's why communication is critical. And communication meaning you will need to, companies are trying to explain as good as they can the rationale behind pay transparency reviews and initiatives. And in the end, this can really benefit employees' trust, trust between employers and employees and HR, of course. So, and you still see here top left, the consensus around this being the top benefit, basically, right? So 84% of participants still see gaining employees' trust as the top benefit. So we see here still a lot of optimism in the perceptions. So we now move to practices. So I'm happy to hand over to Johanna.
Thank you, Davide. Also, good morning from my side. Building on these insights into companies' perceptions of pay transparency, in the next following chapter, The Practice, we will examine how these perspectives are then translated into actions. Within the practices, let's take a first closer look at how companies can be positioned when exploring the association between importance and action taking. The graph divides companies into 3 groups based on awareness and action, with the darker colors indicating a larger number of companies in each cluster. First, we have the first movers on the right side. These companies are both aware, highly aware, and actively taking action, and account for 54% of the respondents, which is compared to 2023 an increase by 8%. This indicates an increasing number of companies taking a proactive stance. Then we have the followers. These companies are moderately aware and taking some action, and they make up for 33% of the respondents, with only a small increase compared to 2023 of 2%. This shows that some companies are progressing steadily, but not yet taking the lead. And then finally, we have the laggards in brownish. These companies are either less aware or have taken minimal action, and they represent 13% of respondents, corresponding to 9 companies in total, which is actually a decrease of 10% compared to 2023. This decline highlights that fewer companies remain inactive suggesting overall momentum in the market towards more engagement and pay transparency. In summary, the majority of companies are either leading or steadily progressing, while the number of companies lagging behind is decreasing, indicating a trend of increasing awareness and action taking. Being active may also involve reviewing the pay structures. And so a substantial majority of 92% of respondents reported that they have recently conducted an internal assessment, either independently or with external support, to identify disparities in their pay structures and inconsistencies. When considering the scope of their initiatives on the right side, most companies, so the 36%, limit them to the European level. Roughly 1/3 of companies scale their efforts on a global level, going beyond the minimal legal requirements to ensure equal treatment for employees across all locations. These companies are tackling the challenge of implementing unified and organizational-wide approaches to pay equity and fairness, demonstrating a clear commitment to consistency as well as also inclusiveness across their global workforce. One can note that only a small minority of only 4% restrict their initiatives as of now to the national level of Switzerland. The remaining organizations, so the 32%, are still reviewing the scope of their initiatives. And this reflects the strategic deliberation that underpin the design and implementation of pay transparency measures. This cautious approach may also stem from the challenge of defining common practices across diverse markets and different organizational structures, as well as some remaining uncertainty maybe around the regulatory expectations, especially when you look at the transposition of the EU that's currently taking place, but also some remaining uncertainties around best practices. On the next slide, we look at how pay transparency is currently communicated within the organization and where companies, as of now, anticipate the most progress in the near future. We start on the left side, and the chart shows the current approach of how information on pay transparency is shared. We see that the largest group, the 43% of companies, share pay information only with a specific group, such as management and HR. This indicates that for many companies, transparency is still a quite selective and controlled topic. What is interesting is that only a small minority of 5%, so around 3 respondents, share openly their pay information with all employees, which highlights that full transparency remains a niche practice. Building on what Davide said earlier about the multidimensional nature of pay transparency, information sharing, what we saw on the left, so communication, is only just one dimension, complemented by processes and outcomes which we can see on the right side. On the right side, the chart illustrates where in which dimension of pay transparency the biggest steps forward are anticipated. So the expected progress on process, meaning how pay is determined, is less than the expected transparency advancements around communication and outcome. HR functions underline especially how getting the communication aspect right, so including not just with candidates and external stakeholders besides the employees, remain a very crucial factor. Nevertheless, we can see that most respondents chose outcome, so the actual pay levels, as a dimension on which most progress is anticipated. And to explore exactly these implications further, we're now going to transition to the next section on priorities, where we focus on how transparency around pay outcomes is then expected to take place and how prepared companies as of now actually feel. For this purpose, a close examination of how companies currently assess performance within their variable pay programs reveals quite a distinction between private and publicly listed companies. As illustrated on the left, approximately half of all participating publicly listed companies determine short-term variable pay based on a combination of company and individual performance criteria. In contrast, Among private companies, short-term variable pay is predominantly tied to company performance, indicating a more organizational-centric approach to performance evaluation. This emphasis on company performance becomes even more pronounced when we turn our attention to the right side, so the long variable pay component. Here we see that listed companies increasingly focus exclusively on company performance as determined by the 54%. Similarly, the majority of private companies either do not incorporate a long-term variable pay component into their remuneration system, but if they do have such a component, if it does exist, they likewise place their primary emphasis on the company performance. Taken together, these findings suggest that company-based performance remains a central determinant of variable pay across both private and public sector, albeit manifesting in different components of their compensation structures. Having examined how companies link performance to variable pay, it is equally important to explore how transparent these compensation structures are perceived to be. A notable distinction emerges between the variable compensation components, so the lower two, compared to the base salary. The variable elements are already perceived as transparent by the majority of participating firms, whereas the base salary is considered moderately or more transparent by only 42% of the respondents. At the same time, this is exactly where the highest anticipation of increasing transparency is anticipated. So companies expect the base salary transparency to grow significantly in the future by the projected 29% in the top right corner. A comparable yet less pronounced trend can also be observed in the variable pay compensations, which may be attributed to the already relatively high perceived transparency in this domain. Overall, the findings point to the widespread expectation of rising transparency across all three dimensions or compensation elements, highlighting a clear trend towards greater visibility of pay outcomes. The resulting question, whether companies feel ready and adequately equipped and prepared for this increase in pay transparency, is addressed in the following slide. Here we can see that approximately half of all the surveyed companies express confidence or even high confidence in their readiness for pay transparency, particularly with regards to sufficiently formalized salary bands, established job architecture, and transparent pay determination processes, so the first three columns. In contrast, managerial preparedness, for instance through HR-led trainings initiatives or equipping leaders with the necessary competencies, reveals substantially higher levels of disagreement, indicated by the 57% and the 69% in the left bottom. These findings, in light of the anticipated increase in pay transparency, highlight the need for further action in developing organizational and leadership readiness. Overall, while pay transparency continues to have momentum, not all companies currently perceive themselves to be ready or fully prepared for the transition towards greater transparency. And with this, I'll hand back to you, Davide, to wrap up our findings.
Thank you, Joanna. So let's wrap up with a few closing thoughts from this here pay transparency survey. So the 2025 results make one thing very clear. So pay transparency isn't just a trend anymore. It's becoming a part of our organization's defined fairness and credibility in the workplace. Still, it's a complex transition for most firms. So let's go back to the metaphor of the cube, but actually 6 faces are probably not enough. So pay transparency has many more dimensions. So what we need here is actually a polyhedron. And let's imagine, at the first glance, wherever you stand, some of the sides remain hidden. So that's how pay transparency feels like you cannot really grasp it all from one standpoint. So what do? We try and we lay down the cube, we unfold it so that we turn this 3-dimensional puzzle into a 2-dimensional map. And we continue and finish with our perceptions, practices, and priorities. So we keep stressing that the relevance and importance keeps growing, especially in larger firms and sectors like industrials and healthcare. Regulatory pressure remains the main driver, but now there's more. There's employees demanding, there's candidates, and even competitors who now set new standards in openness and equity. So when we talk pay transparency, we are not just speaking about numbers, and we notice a consensus really on focusing on pay determination clarity, as well as managing risks at both firm and employee level. From a practice standpoint, the data show momentum of reviews and planning turning into actions. So the goal is really on identifying consistencies and aligning compensation frameworks. And the geographical scope really matters because you can really see a majority addressing both European or a wider scope. And the conversation is maturing towards a more balanced and structured approach. And we see the outcome levels really being the target of most companies in the end. And to conclude with priorities, so progress is expected across all compensation and dimensions. This idea of really addressing communication and explaining that employees the why, it's critical. And we also see a lot of progress being expected on base salaries, which as of now, it's the less transparent dimension or element. So that's why also there's a lot of manager training and readiness programs that have to be developed. But the direction overall is pretty clear. I would say pay transparency is evolving from compliance to culture. And in the end, it's not just about meeting a directive. It's about building trust, driving engagement within the organization, and reinforcing the integrity of the reward systems. So we are very thankful for you joining today's session. And we would like now to start a discussion on how pay transparency is reshaping the future of work. So we would love to open it up for questions. You can use the Q&A function to add them there. We are going to be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thanks, Davide. I think we have one question already, and this was related, I think, to our matrix, Johanna, that you introduced earlier with the first movers. And the question is whether we could explain what the action axis on the horizontal, how this is defined.
Yeah, great question. That's what we referred as action. So there we measure action with taking changes. So the first step usually is reviewing pay, and then you would set up plans and then implement those. So the most advanced status would be changes already implemented, and it's just a very, very limited slice of the pie that has done that. Then the second stage would be under implementation. And then the third stage, which is actually the most common as of now, is under review with changes expected in the future. So it's really about whether companies are reviewing and then taking the step further and implementing the intended changes. So thank you very much for the question. Maybe there is another one on job architecture. So when firms review pay transparency, yes, so it's about harmonization across countries, right? So we've mentioned the geographical scope being rather wide for some organization. How does it work then from a job architecture perspective?
Well, I think that really depends on the company itself and the stage in which a company is with regards to implementation of a job architecture. I've experienced companies in the last 3-4 years to really take on this topic and to make it a priority within HR. Meaning that this is really part of the proper preparation process in order to be able to implement and execute pay transparency. Meaning the companies that we have advised typically select their job architecture if they don't have one in place, which is still the case for some companies, also at the larger level. So they select the job architecture and then they implement it stepwise, and typically, yes, it's across countries. So you really try to get alignment to your different employees in countries, right?
Thank you.
Well, maybe also in addition here, and this is a very good point, Hannah, I think also from a board perspective within the compensation and remuneration committee, you know, depending on the programs running, I think on a global perspective with different tax issues, for example, with the ESPP, I think the support here is really needed, right? Because the complexity again is high, and to level out the transparency, I think this is very nice.
Absolutely. And for me, you know, to continue there, for me, it was very interesting to see in the newest results of our survey that 2 years ago we learned, there's a quick win. The quick win is the process on pay, right? Where we can warrant transparency quite easily by setting up a pay process that is understandable for employees in general, right? That they can reconcile how they pay, how their pay is determined. But now we see an anticipated shift here, right, to communication and also to the outcome. And I think this makes it a bit more tricky now that more companies are ready with their salary bands based on a proper job architecture, etc. They have very much worked on their pay processes. And now we're there, right? We're just one step before actual pay transparency on the outcome. And this is a nice progress, and we're very happy to also help companies, of course, overcoming these hurdles that are now in the room.
Yeah, it's nice. And what we all agreed, right? From a regulatory perspective, the trend is very clear. So just looking, for example, what is going on in the US and the UK, I think just we're a step ahead. So I'm really looking forward to continue that study here. And really embrace also the trends. So just from my side, Hannah and team, I think the insights are tremendous. And I would love to give it over to Davide for the final word, right?
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Hannah. I also see a question here on whether you will receive the presentation. Yes, you will. You will get a report in the next days with the same data points summarized with some narrative as well guiding you through. And maybe it comes too late, but I would like to thank you, all of those of you that took the time and filled out the survey, because without that, we wouldn't be here. So I know that some of you are probably here and listening. So thank you so much for taking the time and taking the survey. We know that survey fatigue is an issue out there. So thank you for prioritizing this one. And if you have any more questions, feel free to add them. We still have a few minutes on our side. Otherwise, we just wish you a very nice and productive day.
Yeah, I think we close here. Should there be any further questions, you're very welcome to send us an email or get in touch elsewise. Thank you so much for joining today. Have a great rest of the day and see you soon.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, dear.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye, Michelle. We speak
Goodbye,
soon.
Davide.
Goodbye.
Speak soon. Thanks for
Bye.
the initiative. Also, Johanna, have a great day.
Pleasure. Thank you,
You too.
you too,
Goodbye.
and safe travels.
Thank you. Bye there.
Goodbye.
Bye.